Jonah Berger, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited having read your books, Contagious, Catalyst, Invisible Influence, and now Magic Words. Can't wait to talk about magic words. Before we do, though, Jonah, would love to know whereabouts you grew up and how your upbringing impacted the kind of person you've become.
Sure. I grew up in Washington, D.C., or I should say right outside of Washington, D.C. Was born in Washington, D.C., but grew up right side of Washington, D.C. I went to a high school that focused on math, science, and computer science. So like a magnet high school. Thought I wanted to be an environmental engineer, either that or design sneakers, one of the other. Went to college at Stanford to study something called science, technology, and society, which is the intersection of science and technology and society. Ended up reading a piece in my first class there that was about how we build buildings and how that shapes how we raise our children. So the idea was you build small houses and kids can play in the street because you can see your kids play. But once we build these big buildings, now we're less comfortable letting our kids outside because we can't see them play. And that shapes how they grow up, right? They're less likely to have friends in the neighborhood and so on. And I thought this was really neat, the intersection of the two. And I said, hey, are there any other you might recommend? And they said, oh, you should check out social psychology. And so that kind of started a journey for me. I took all the social psychology related courses that Stanford had. I also took a lot of sociology courses of social networks and things along those lines. I started taking some marketing courses. Read a book called The Tipping Point, as many people have, that led me to design a major combining a few different things. And then I, by the name of Chip Heath, joined Stanford in the business school. And I started doing research with him on why people remember things and why they share things. And the rest is kind of history. I got interested in academic research, started doing work on what makes things viral, why people share things. And that led me to Wharton and the work I do today.
Jonah, I love that background and the fact that I see you have married your engineering mindset with influence over the past 10 or so years in writing different books, talking about in the books the influence that environment also has on us.
Yes.
So there's a lot that you have pulled together. Now, you also talk about influence and the mindset that positive influence takes. So, what is the mindset that you believe is important before we talk about the specifics that you also go into in this book with respect to magic words?
I think the challenge is people say, oh, influence. Isn't that a bad thing? We don't want to be manipulating people. People don't like to be influenced and so on. And I agree. Manipulating people is bad. I agree that people don't want to be influenced. The challenge is that we're influenced all the time. Right? If the weather's nice outside, we'll probably end up being happier as a result. If salad is put at the beginning of a buffet line rather at the end, we're probably more likely to pick more vegetables. And so even if no one's trying to influence us, our environment and the others around us are influencing us all the time. And so to me, influence is neither positive nor negative. If I told you I'm going to use influence to help people save the environment, make better decisions, and live happier lives, you'd say, fantastic, go ahead and do it. If on the other hand, I said, hey, I'm going to use influence to help people buy things they don't need and be unhealthy and be mean to their friends, you'd say, no, influence is bad. And so in some sense, influence is like a hammer. A hammer can be used to build something. It can also be used to hurt someone. Influence is neither good nor bad. The tools are neither good nor bad. It's how we use them. And so to go back to your question about a mindset, I think we really need to step back and say, what am I using influence for? As a leader, am I using influence to help move my organization in a good direction, help consumers and clients make better decisions, help people live happier lives? Or am I using influence more negatively? And I can't tell you how you are using influence as an individual, but what I can say is please use those tools for good.
When we think about the most powerful leaders throughout history or organizational leaders, people that have done great things have used influence as well as people that have done not so great things.
Yes.
So it is a tool that can be used. Now, in this book, you go specifically into the power of words. So, what impact do words have in influencing others?
So I think it's important to step back for a second. Anytime we're trying to influence others, we are often using language in one way, shape, or form. Whether we want to influence a customer or client, we're probably making a phone call, writing an email, making a presentation. When we're trying to influence employees or an organization, we send out a note, we call a meeting, we pass around a memo. We use language all the time. Now, you and I are talking through language. We use language to convince clients, we use language to hold attention, we use language to connect with our loved ones. Language is how leaders lead, it's how doctors connect with patients, it's how politicians get votes and connect with their audience. And so Even our private thoughts rely on language. Almost everything we do relies on language. And so the question then is, how can we use it better? And I agree that many of us think about language somewhat. When I'm making a presentation, I think about what are the ideas that I want to get across. We think a lot about the high level concepts of what we want to talk about. We think a lot less about how we should talk about it, the specific words we should use to talk about it, because we don't think they matter. We're focused on the what and less the how. And that's a big mistake, because as I talk about in the book, there are 6 types of magic words, and magic words can have a huge influence on our impact. Saying I recommend something versus I like something can make people a third more likely to listen to your advice. A simple word like because can increase your influence by 50%. There are a variety of different things we can use, everything from individual words to phrases and ways of suggesting language that can increase our impact in every domain of life. And so the book is really encouraging us to pay attention to language and how we use it and help us think about how to use it more effectively.
In using it more effectively, I saw a lot of relevance to leaders of organizations. The first set of words that you talk about is in activating identity and the importance of identity. How can we think about identity in the words that we use to communicate?
So I'll start with a simple example, and maybe we can talk about a couple from this chapter, whatever works for you. But the idea at a high level, as you noted, is words don't just tell people what we want or suggest what we want to do or provide information. Words suggest things about identity and agency. They suggest what it means to engage in a particular action. They suggest who's in charge and who's to blame. And so we want to use those words, this type of words, thoughtfully. I'll give you one example. So often as leaders, we ask people for help. We might say, hey, can you help me with this in particular? Or we ask for help in other ways. We often use verbs. The word help is a verb, right? To help. And so we ask someone, can you help us? Or if you're working at a nonprofit, for example, that's trying to get out the vote, you might send people a letter saying, hey, please go vote. Vote being an action, a verb, something that you can do. But it turns out a subtle shift in our language there can have an important impact on how influential we are and how likely people are to follow our advice. So there's a great study that was done at Stanford University a number of years ago where they went to a local elementary school and they asked students, there was a big mess on the floor of the elementary school, lots of blocks lying around, lots of crayons that needed to be cleaned up. And for some of the students, they said, hey, can you help out? Can you help clean up? And some students did. But for a second set of students, it's an experiment here, so like an A/B test. For a second set of students, they said, hey, can you be a helper and clean up? Now, I want to focus on the differences there because they're very subtle. The word help and the word helper are only 2 letters different. In both cases, the letters H-E-L-P are there. In one case, you're just adding an E-R at the end, but it led to a third increase in the percentage of people that helped. And you might say, well, that's just kids cleaning up a classroom. What does that have to do with being a leader? Does it actually matter for adults? Well, there was another study done recently, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where they actually sent letters to people's houses trying to get them to vote. This is part of a Get Out the Vote initiative. And for some people, they got a letter that said, please vote. And for other people, they got a letter saying, please be a voter. Now, again, vote and voter are very similar, even more similar than help and helper, because vote already has the E. So it's only adding an R, 1 letter difference. Yet it led to a 15% increase in the percentage of people that voted. And so you might be sitting there going, why? Why does voter or helper lead to more helping or voting than help and helper? And it turns out it's all about turning actions into identities. So let me give you an example. Imagine I told you about 2 people. I have one friend who runs and I have another friend who is a runner. If you had to guess, which of them do you think runs more often?
The
What do you
runner
think?
by far.
The
The
runner,
runner.
right? You'd say, oh, it sounds like that's who they are. If I told you someone they love dogs, so they're a dog lover, you'd say, dog lover loves dogs more. Same thing if I told you about 2 people, right? Someone leads and someone is a leader. You'd say, oh, the person who's a leader leads more often. It's a stable trait. It's part of who they are. And so nouns suggest identity. Leader, runner, dog lover suggest identity. And that has some important implications. First, if we want people to do something, don't just talk about that thing as an action, talk about it as an identity. Helping is fine, voting is fine, but getting an opportunity to be a helper, getting an opportunity to see ourselves as a voter, that's really desirable. I want to see myself as a good person. And so I'm more likely to engage in the actions to claim those desired identities. Note, by the way, that the same thing happens on the opposite side. If I want people saying losing is bad, being a loser is worse. Cheating is bad, being a cheater is worse. And so research shows that if you want to get people not to cheat in the classroom, tell them not to be a cheater, makes them less likely to do it because it's a negative identity. And so people avoid the behavior to avoid grabbing the identity. And so first, again, if we want to get people to do something or not doing something, turn actions into identities. But second, we can use this to shape how both we as leaders and others are perceived. If on a resume, if someone says, I'm hardworking, suggest you're hardworking sometimes. If they say I'm a hard worker, suddenly now it's an identity that seems more stable. Being creative, that's nice. Being a creator suggests it's more stable. An influencer suggests it's a full-time job. It's something that you do. And so whether we're describing ourselves, whether we're describing peers, the language we use can have a big impact on how they're perceived. And so that's just one example of the language of identity and agency. I talk about 3 more in the book, but the language you use shapes how people are seen and the roles they engage in.
It is so powerful as I was thinking about this, Jonah, whether it is, as you mentioned, when we are talking to ourselves, the identities that we associate with ourselves and how we speak to ourselves, or when it's talking to people in our team and organizations, identity is a big part of it. And a lot of times I know LinkedIn has a way based on people's interactions to figure out when they are more likely to leave a job or not. And I imagine identity is a big part of people associating with an organization or wanting to disassociate with an organization as well.
Yeah, there's some great research I talk about in the book. And it's one of my, I would say, one of my favorite language papers recently, where they look at the language we use in email, right? And we don't think much about the language we use in email, but they mine the email language over a number of months, hundreds of people in a medium-sized company. And they look at whether that language predicts future actions. And they find something really interesting. They find that language, just the language you use in your email, can predict whether you're going to be promoted or fired, and even whether you're going to leave the company to do something different in the future. How does that work? They look at the beginning and they say, okay, what's the language you use? And what's the language that the people in your company use? Not surprising, when you join a company, you're not part of the organization yet. You don't know the language that people use. And so at the beginning, it's pretty different. But what they find is that people who end up doing well in the company, their language becomes more similar to the organization over time. Yes, they start off as different, but eventually they become closer. They, in some sense, acclimate or enculturate to the company. Whereas people that never acclimate, never enculturate, that's an indication they're not doing so well. And those folks are actually more likely to be fired. But what is also interesting is it's not just, hey, can you enculturate or not? And that's good news, by the way, because you might think, oh, you're either a good member of the company. It's about whether you change over time. It is possible to change. But then they look at the people who already fit in. They've already been able to match the company's language. And they look at what happens next. And I think this part is really powerful. Some people keep behaving similarly to others in the company. Others diverge again. And it's not that they couldn't be similar. They can be similar. They became similar, but then they stop being similar. And what happens to those folks? Those folks end up leaving the company. Not because they got fired, because they found a better job elsewhere. And so language not only tells us, hey, can you fit in? Are you going to be promoted or fired? But also, are you less interested in what's going on at the company anymore and more likely to leave for greener pastures? And so this is in the chapter on the language of similarity and difference. And so it's not just about identity and agency, which is powerful, but another type of language is how similar or different the words we use are to others, or the words different things are to one another. And so that language can also provide insight as well.
You mentioned it helps explain everything from who gets promoted or becomes friends to who gets fired or goes on to get a second date. So that language of similarity plays a huge role. Now, one of the other things you mentioned, one of the other types of words to increase impact is conveying confidence. And one of the things that I talk about, Jonah, is humble confidence. And some of the leaders that repeatedly mentioned as great examples come across with humility. You use the example, not to get into politics of it, of Trump coming across extremely confident. So where is the balance with respect to leadership communication, where the confidence is something that is appealing and works, but not overdone?
Yeah. So let's step back for a second. Just at a high level, I talk about 6 types of language in the book, and I put them in a framework called the SPEAK framework. SPEACC. I wasn't clever enough to come up with a K, so that's why it's two C's instead of a K. But that stands for the language of similarity and difference, as we've talked about a little bit already. The language of posing questions and the power of that type of language. The E is for the language of emotion. The A is for the language of agency and identity. The C is for the language of confidence, is one of the C's. And the second C is the language of concreteness. And so under each of these is a class of language that we can use more effectively. And there are 3, 4, maybe even 5 strategies underneath each. The language of confidence is, I think, really interesting one. And so I'll start, as you asked, by talking about Trump a little bit, and then we'll talk about some different things, because I think the language of confidence is a little bit complicated. And whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, I don't want to get into politics here. I know people have vastly different opinions. Some people love him, some people hate him. I'm not into fighting with your audience about whatever they believe. Whatever they believe is fine. Whether you like him or not, though, you can't deny that he has done a great job of selling his ideas. Whether you love those ideas or hate those ideas, he's done a great job of selling, right? His audience listens to him, they follow him, they believe what he has to say. If you look at one of the speeches he made when he first came out, he said something like, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to build a great, amazing wall. And I'm going to do it inexpensively because I'm a great leader. We don't do well anymore as a country. We're always losing. We're losing trade deals to China. I beat China all the time. If I'm elected, I'm going to do this all the time without a question. And when he made this speech, many people laughed at him, right? It was filled with things that didn't necessarily all fit together. It was a lot of bluster. It was overly simplistic. And a year later, he was elected president. And so again, even if you hate him, which is, and everybody's entitled to their opinion, even if you hate him, he's doing something that is working. So what is that? And if you actually look at the language he used, he's not unique, right? He's a unique person, but many other people that we find charismatic, whether we like them or not, use similar language. You look at the language of startup founders, whether you take someone like Steve Jobs or others. Look at the language of gurus, folks that get a lot of attention. Look at famous individuals who are seen as great speakers. They often do one thing in particular, which is they speak with a great deal of certainty. And what do I mean by a great deal of certainty? Something isn't just going to happen. It's definitely going to happen. An answer isn't just maybe a good answer. It's obviously the right course of action. Everyone believes something. It's clear. This is absolutely true without a question. They use a great deal of certainty in their language. And note, though, that's quite different from what most of us do most of the time. So I'm an academic. I'm guilty of this more than anybody. But academics often say things like, I think this is true. This might be true. This probably will happen. You know what? Maybe this strategy could work. As a consultant, I often come into companies and they ask for help with particular things. And I say, look, I think this is a good course of action. To me, this seems like a good strategy. This might work, and so on. All of those are hedges. I think, seems to me, might, could, probably. And hedges are not always bad, right? There are times when we want to hedge, and I'll get to that in a second. But the problem with hedging is we often use them without even thinking about it. We often just do them because they're a verbal tick. And the problem is, without intending to, it undermines our influence. Because research we conducted shows the more that communicators hedge, the less audiences are persuaded by what they have to say. The less likely they'll follow your suggestion, take your advice, buy a product or service, do what you suggested, because they make you as a communicator seem less confident about what you're saying. If you say, this will probably work, a listener's going, you're not even sure it's going to work. Why should we do it? Right? If you're not even clear, why should we do it? Maybe we'll just go find something else. If a strategy might work, well, if it might work, I'll go find another strategy. And by the way, as a leader, if you seem so uncertain, maybe I better go find somebody else that is. And so a couple things here. First, I'm not saying never hedge. There are times when you want to communicate uncertainty, but be aware of when we're hedging and be sure we want to do it. There are so many people in my own life I look that speak with such certainty, even when they're wrong. And I sit there going, oh, but they're wrong. The problem is other people listen. And so as leaders, if our goal is to get people to listen, we need to speak with more certainty. Secondly, though, there are some hedges that are more effective than others. So take the difference between it seems like this is a good strategy versus seems to me like this is a good strategy, or this might work versus I think that this might work. Those cases, adding an I, to me, my opinion, all of them associate the uncertainty with the self. And we actually find that increases persuasion relative to other hedges. So rather than it seems like this strategy work, it seems to me like this strategy will work, is more persuasive because it makes you as a leader, as a communicator, seem more certain. Yes, there's some uncertainty in the world, but you feel confident about what you're saying. It seems to me that this is true. And so your confidence is affecting that judgment. And so what I would say is when you're going to hedge, use some of those personal hedges. The last thing I would say is I certainly agree with you that it's not always good to be certain. So there's some very nice work that shows when you're talking to someone who maybe strongly disagrees with you, or you want to show that you're receptive to other opinions, using hedges sometimes shows that you're willing to consider other perspectives. When Trump speaks, it doesn't seem like he's willing to consider other perspectives. And so, again, like we talked about before with tools, certainty is a tool. We need to understand how to use it. If our goal is persuasion, if our goal is to get people on board and they're already pretty close, speak with certainty. If, on the other hand, we're talking to someone who we know is already going to disagree with us, and we know they don't think we're very receptive to their viewpoints, we want to seem open-minded, then using a little bit of hedges, particularly those personal hedges, again, seeming confident but open-minded, can be helpful.
This is really important, Jonah, in that intellectual humility is important for leaders, especially at uncertain times which we live through. However, communicating in a way that seems uncertain doesn't add value. So I've seen a lot of leaders in trying to come across as more engaging, more humble, communicate in a way that they seem uncertain of what they are communicating, and that makes it less likely for others to buy it. So there's a
Yeah.
difference between intellectual humility and how we communicate.
Yeah. And if I might say one more thing here, sometimes people say, oh, what if there is some uncertainty? But you can also shrink the world, right? There's a difference between, I'm not sure what we should do, and I'm sure we should focus on this area, but here are the two options that might be good. Making clear what parts are certain and parts uncertain. Look, this is going to be a really important strategy. I'm not sure if this strategy is going to work. I'm sure the strategy is going to work, but to make it work, we need to make sure this part happens appropriately, right? You know what needs to happen. You are certain. And so rather than saying you're not sure the strategy is going to work, saying you're sure it's going to work if we do this particular thing. And so there are ways to be clear that not everything is going to happen, but that we are certain about certain aspects of it.
It makes a huge difference in the way we communicate. Now, the other part of it is that the magic words are not just with respect to what we say. You mentioned the power of questions. I had a conversation with Wharton Berger also. He has a couple of outstanding books on questions, but the types of questions we ask make a difference. So it's not just asking questions to ask questions.
Yeah, as I've written more books and thought more about the space, I've learned more and more about questions, and they're so powerful. We often think questions are about collecting information or gaining knowledge, but they're a lot more than that. Questions shape how people perceive us. They shape what other people give attention to. Question serves many different functions. And so I talk a lot about the power of questions, not only why we should ask them in general, but the types of questions we should ask and how to ask better questions. And so I'll give you a couple examples. The first is something as simple as just asking for advice. Most of us are wary of asking for advice. Why? We don't want to bother someone. We're not sure they'll know the right answer. And even worse, we're worried they might think less of us, particularly as a leader, when we think that our job is to have the right answer all the time. We don't want to ask people for advice because we're worried they'll think we don't know what we're doing. We're incompetent. We're not sure of ourselves. We're uncertain, as we talked about before. And so maybe we don't ask for advice. And that's a mistake because some research looked at asking for advice, and they had people have interactions with other people that asked for advice and other people that didn't ask for advice. And what they found was really insightful. So first, asking for advice didn't make us seem worse, didn't make us seem less competent, less knowledgeable, or anything along those lines. Second, it actually had the exact opposite effect. Asking for advice made us seem more competent, not less, smarter and more intelligent, not less. And so you might say, why is that? Why would asking for advice make it us seem like we know more, we're smarter? And the reason is quite simple, which is that people, basically everybody, loves feeling like they give good advice, right? Everyone is self-centered. Everyone thinks their advice is wonderful. I think my advice is fantastic. And so when you come along, whether you are a colleague of mine, whether you're an employee, whoever you are, if you ask me for my advice, I go, I give great advice. And so you're smart enough to ask me for my advice. You must be a pretty smart person. And so asking for advice takes advantage of the fact that communicators like feeling good about themselves, and in an easy way to not only gain information and insight, which asking for advice does, but also to make ourselves look more positively as a result. But asking for advice is just one type of questions and effective questions. Other research looks at social interactions, what types of questions are particularly impactful. Sometimes we think question asking is about being polite. So at the beginning of this interaction, you might have said something like, oh, hey, Jonah, how are you? And I might have said, oh, great, how are you? That question is at the beginning of a conversation. It's a question to be polite. And it's also a reciprocal question. When someone asks us a question, we ask a similar question back, right? If somebody says, what are you having for lunch? I might say, peanut butter and jelly, what are you having? And that's a question, but it doesn't really say much about me except that I'm a polite person. But there is a type of questions that does lead to better interactions, and those are called follow-up questions. And what do I mean by that? So if someone says, man, I thought that was a really good meeting, not just saying, yeah, I did too, but saying, oh, interesting. Yeah, what did you find interesting about it? Or if a spouse or a partner says, oh man, I had a tough day at work, not just saying, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, saying, oh, what was so difficult about it? A son or daughter says, I had a really good day at school. Interesting. What'd you learn? Those are questions that don't just say, hey, I heard what you said, but I paid attention to what you said. I heard what you said, and I care enough to follow up. And that follow up shows that we're being responsive, shows that we care about the audience, and as a result, leads them to like us more. And so, whether we're looking at conversations through speed dating, whether we're looking at conversations at the office, asking follow up questions makes people like us more because it shows that we're being responsive. And so, asking for advice and asking for follow ups are just two types of questions I talk about. In that chapter, I talk about questions that allow us to get to the root of problems and questions that allow us to fend off inappropriate or information gathering requests that we don't want to answer. But there are lots of types of questions that can really increase our impact in a variety of different ways.
It's most important to have that genuine curiosity, mindset of curiosity. But as you said, the most interesting people are typically people who can ask great questions. Another thing I would love to get your thoughts on, Jonah, is the power of storytelling. In many instances, the leaders that I interact with understand the need for storytelling, but are not that great at storytelling. So, what do you see it both in this book and in previous books? You've talked about the need for emotion and storytelling as a vehicle. What do you see as essential elements of storytelling, especially in a business leadership context?
Yeah, there's so many great things about the power of stories. I talk a lot in Contagious about the power of stories to carry ideas along for the ride, the notion of kind of Trojan horse stories and how they share morals or information. You tell your kids not to lie. They say, oh, okay, mom and dad, sure. You tell them the story of the boy who cried wolf. They pay attention because they want to figure out what happened to the boy. But along the way, they also learn that lying is a bad idea. And so stories are great vessels for communicating information. People sometimes talk about stories like flight simulators. They help people learn things that you want them to take away. But I think as leaders, storytelling is powerful. And there's also the stories we tell about ourselves. Maybe you've just been appointed to a new role at a new organization. You're coming in, you're talking to the team for the first time, or maybe you're lucky enough to be the head of that organization. You're coming in and talking to them. Often, I think too many leaders, as we talked about before, sometimes can seem overconfident. They talk about all the great things that are out there, which can be good, but it doesn't help their employees, their audience resonate with them as people. If this person's just been so successful, it's hard for me to empathize with them because maybe I don't see myself as successful. I don't see myself as the same as them. Same often you hear companies, famous companies say, oh, we're doing so well. And we started our company last year and we're worth $1 billion. And it just seems like such a path to success that any entrepreneurs that aren't feeling like they're on that path just go, man, I can't see this company as similar to me. And that's a mistake because there's an opportunity to make a connection. So if you look at one thing great storytellers do, is they often make their stories not just like peaks of mountaintops. Here's this thing we did, and here's this thing we did, and they're all fantastic, and they're all wonderful, and I am just a wonderful person. The valleys often make the peaks more impactful, right? If you hear about someone who had some success, maybe they went to a great college, but then they dropped out because they were having difficulty at home with their family or they didn't have enough money. But then they worked through it and they ended up getting a job at this company and they did so well. But then the company went bankrupt and then they bounced around between jobs. And finally, they got this job where they did so well. Suddenly now you go, that person's like me because we all have pitfalls in our lives. We all have situations where we didn't succeed. Something didn't work out. We overcame some barriers. And so treating stories not just as a highlight reel, a series of the best things that happened, whether we're talking about our company or ourselves, can make people resonate more with what we're saying. If there are lots of ups and downs, suddenly people go, wow, that's more like my own life. Right? That person overcame so much. Not only is it more powerful that they got to where they are today, but I can see that I can do the same thing. Wow, if my new boss, yeah, they're my boss, but they dealt with some of the same issues I'm dealing with, a lack of confidence or some health issues in the family or balancing work and life, and seeing that they dealt with those same issues and this is how they resolve them will make me feel like I can overcome those own issues and own challenges in my own life. And so I think treating stories a little bit more like roller coasters, adding downs before the ups, can be a really powerful way to help the audience connect with what you're doing. There's a podcast I really love called How I Built This, which many of your listeners are probably familiar with. Guy Raz leads it, and he talks to startup founders and leaders about things they've overcome. And he does a great job of not only hitting the highlights, but hitting the ups and downs along the way. And social media can often feel like a highlight reel. It makes it hard to connect with people. If we're hoping to connect with our audiences, showing the downs as well as the ups can be a great way to do that.
Well, you have helped me connect with you and learn a lot from you over the years, Jonah. How can the audience find out more about you, the book Magic Words?
Oh, thank you. The book is available wherever books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you like to go, independent booksellers, wherever you like to go for books. They can learn more about me on my website, which is just jonahberger.com. There's a lot of free resources there. There's an overview of the framework of the book. There are some one-page guides about how to use magic words more effectively in all areas of your life. And they can also connect with me either on Twitter at J1Berger or on LinkedIn there as well.
I love the book. It's one that I will reread, Jonah, because understanding it intellectually is one thing. Practicing it,
Yes.
using these words is very different. So it's not just to be read so you understand it. It's something that we can continually practice. And I appreciate even at the end of every one of the chapters, you re-summarize so we can reflect on an ongoing basis. Am I actually using these or not, which can help us become more effective?
Certainly. Yeah, definitely. My favorite books have bookmarks in them and page notes and other things. And I built the one pager that's on the website similarly to help us. I put things like that up in front of my desk. So when I'm dealing with a difficult conversation, I look at it and it reminds me as a guide. And so I think practicing is often with these things quite important.
Jonah Berger, it's a joy speaking with you because leadership is a lot about positive influence, whether it's communicating strategy of the organization or getting the team energized to move toward that purpose. And your work, Invisible Influence, Catalyst, Contagious, and now Magic Words have helped me understand influence better. And I'm sure will help the audience lead their teams and organizations more effectively. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me.